And we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Schumacher, and welcome to Bible Geeks. This is Season 3, Week 5, Book 4. So we are going through the Psalms in parallel with our sermon series that I guess it concluded a couple weeks ago on worship at the First Presbyterian Church of River Forest in Illinois, just outside Chicago. And we are finishing up, though, with our review of the Psalms. So the Psalms are what our sermon series have been based off of as we were looking at how we were worshiping. And Bible Geeks is all about looking into the historical and theological and cultural context behind the Bible so we can really get a full and deep understanding of what the Bible was talking about, especially in the poetic books that can use language we're not familiar with. In fact, do use language that we're not familiar with. And today's is going to be a little bit more along those lines. The episode we did last time on the Divine Council and looking at the ancient Near Eastern pantheon was really well received after the class. And so I wanted to go into that a little bit more because where else, at least for the folks at our church, where else other than Bible Geeks are you going to be able to learn this kind of stuff unless you decide to go sign up and take a graduate level course yourself, which very few of you have time to do. So here you go. Let's dig into it here at Bible Geeks. So for the next, I'm actually not sure how long this is going to go. I believe it'll be on the shorter side, but we'll see. I could be made a fool. So before we get into the normal overview of what we're going to talk about today, I wanted to start with a question. Excuse me. What is this a picture of? Does anybody know what this is? This is what we're going to be talking about today. Oh my goodness. Well, PowerPoint Online. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, now we're going to be talking about Psalms Book 4. I think an update got pushed. So how about this? I'll save. And then we're going to blow that back up. And then shrink it down. And click ahead. And we're back. Okay. So yeah, the question is, what is this a picture of? And so we're going to look at by the end of today, you're going to know what this is a picture of, if you don't already. So today's topics, we're going to be looking at an overview of Book 4. As we've been going through, we had the first week on how to read the Psalms, and then an overview of Books 1, 2, 3, now 4, and then 5 will be next time. Authorship, genres, themes, and then we're going to talk about ancient Near Eastern cosmic geography. We're going to be using Psalm 104 as our example, and we're going to be understanding the language that's used and what it's really getting at, and then what we should make of all of these ancient Near Eastern references in the Psalms. So it builds a little bit on last week, but makes it more practical. We talked about the usage of ancient Near Eastern categories for the pantheon of gods, the Divine Council, and how we were to understand that. And then we looked at that curveball that Jesus threw us in John chapter 10 when he quoted Psalm 82, I said you are gods. But there was a little bit of a lingering question there, which is, if the Bible is speaking in those categories, what do we make of that now in the 21st century? This is going to be even more driven home today when we're looking at cosmic geography, when we're looking at cosmology generally, about where is the Earth situated, what are the heavens, what is or is not space or the stars, or there's discussion about waters, and as we look through and see the way that the ancients talked about it, and the fact that those idioms or those illustrations are contained in the Bible, what are we 21st century people who now have satellites that can look down on the world and understand thermodynamics and astronomy way better than we did before? What are we to make of all of that? But we'll start here with Book 4. So we've been looking at these snapshots from the Psalms Explorer from Logos Bible software. So Book 4, authorship. You can see, so Book 4 runs Psalms 90 through 106. And so you've got 16 Psalms. Now, any of you who might be particularly visually intelligent or mathematically astute can see that there are more than 16 bubbles on here. That would be because you can see there's some attribution duplication. You see the Septuagint has many of these labeled as Psalms of David, and the Hebrew text has them as anonymous. Uh, I'd go with the Hebrew text on this one. The anonymous is quite likely, especially if we go back to the end of Book 2, the prayers of David, the son of Jesse, have concluded. The writing of this part, as we've been talking about too, there's a progression through Israelite history, through books 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. They are very unlikely to be written by David. These are likely post-exilic psalms. And so they're written by non-monarchs because at this point in time, there is no monarchy anymore. You do notice a few others that are attributed to David. Again, the editorial compilation is different than the order in which everything goes in the Psalms. So, to talk out of both sides of my mouth for a moment, yes, the prayers of David, the son of Jesse, were concluded, Psalm 72, but you see some other psalms that were likely written by David scattered later, likely part of the editorial assembly in order to make a point. But the one that sticks out to me here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about, is Psalm 90, attributed to Moses. So the first psalm in Book 4 is attributed to Moses. If you remember last time, Psalm 89, the question was about the Davidic covenant. And in fact, I can pull up here. Let's bring Logos into the picture for a second. Psalm 89. All right, so Psalm 89. So yeah, I actually like that it brought the commentary up down here. That might as well say what I was going to say. Will God keep his promises? And we talked last time about how Psalm 89 ends with the question as to whether or not the Davidic covenant is going to stay in effect, if it is actually going to come true. So Psalm 89 concludes, Lord, where is your unfailing love? You promised it to David with a faithful pledge. Consider, Lord, how your servants are disgraced. I carry in my heart the insults of so many people. Your enemies have mocked me, Yahweh. They mock your anointed king wherever he goes. And then the doxology, praise Yahweh forever, amen and amen. So we talked about how this was the question of the Davidic covenant, and if you want more information on that, you can go back and watch the Book 3 video, which goes into the specifics on that. So now we get to Book 4, and we see Moses. So the Psalm of Moses seems historically out of place, right? So the question is, did Moses actually write it? The Psalms of Moses, you would not expect a Psalm of Moses to come at Book 4. Book 4 is in the exile and then coming out of the exile. So a Psalm of Moses wouldn't be expected to be historically situated here. So the question would be, did Moses actually write it? And the answer is, well, maybe. Could be. We can't really say one way or the other. Remember, I said in the initial discussion on how to read through the Psalms, we can generally take the superscripts as authorial, except where there's good reason to believe that that might not be the case. And in this case, I would say there's a pretty good argument that it's not the case, because this is showing up historically where you would expect post-exilic or exilic authors to be, which was 1,000 years after Moses. So now some people do argue that the language is archaic. There's some vocabulary similarities with the Torah. So there are some people who actually do make an argument that we are seeing the words of Moses here. Others, such as Dahoudi, who wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on Psalms, said, yes, the language is old, but it's not that old. It's more like around the time of David. So maybe it was a Davidic psalm. Most scholars, I would agree with them, place it as post-exilic, also due to vocabulary similarities with later psalms. I wouldn't necessarily use that reasoning. In fact, what I want to say is, what does this tell us about vocabulary studies? Again, some argue that there's archaic vocabulary. Some say there's later vocabulary. My advice to you on vocabulary studies. If you can use a vocabulary study to support different, potentially opposite, contradictory conclusions, don't put too much stock in them. I'm speaking to anybody who's ever heard something like, oh, 1 Peter and 2 Peter look really different, therefore Peter couldn't have written both of them. Or there's the accepted Pauline corpus and the disputed Pauline corpus, because look at the word differences. If you look at a paper I wrote for school, and you look at a document that I've written for work, and you look at these PowerPoint presentations, and you look at emails that I've written, and then you look at letters I've written to my wife, they are so different. They're vastly different in terms of the vocabulary that's used, in terms of the tone that's used, in terms of the genre. Even when you look at like emails that I've written on theological topics and papers I've written on theological topics. If you look at emails I've written to different audiences on theological topics, they're vastly different. Sometimes they're these 2,500 page tomes. Other times they're these 30 or 40 or 50 word or 300 word summaries that are going to a particular question that I've been given. Especially with the letters, we're reading somebody else's mail. We're only seeing half of it. I would not let anybody tell you that because the words are different and the sentence structure is different and the Greek is advanced in one and not advanced in the other, therefore these are written by different people. I would just discard that reasoning. Nobody has any proof for it. It's all conjecture. So vocabulary studies, I wouldn't worry about them too much. So let's think a little bit more about this then, the Psalm of Moses. And I'm alerting you right now, this is Ryan conjecture. I didn't find anything in the literature that goes specifically to this point. I think Hasselbullock would probably be sympathetic to the position, but he did not put anything like this in print. In fact, I probably shouldn't have even mentioned his name there. But we'll do it this way. So, historically, Book 3 ended with Psalm 89. The question was about God's faithfulness to his covenant, particularly because it seemed like they were kicked out of the land, so the Abrahamic covenant was over. The Sinai covenant, there are curses for disobedience as well as the land promise, and the death of the monarchy, ergo no more Davidic covenant. So there's the question about God's faithfulness to his covenants. So what event in Israelite history is parallel with the exile? The question of will God be faithful to his covenants is because they're going into exile. They are no longer in the land that was given to Abraham. The covenant curses have been executed. The temple has been destroyed. God is no longer on his throne in Jerusalem, and neither is the Davidic monarch. And then they've been deported to captivity underneath another ruler. The other event in Israelite history that's parallel with the exile is the bondage in Egypt. And who is in charge of Egypt? Who is in charge of the Israelites during the Exodus? Who led the Israelites out of Egypt? Moses. Remember, the Psalms are not necessarily in distinct chronological order. They're compiled by an editor. And so why would the editor situate a psalm associated with Moses in whatever capacity right after the question of the exile? Oh God, will you be faithful to your covenant? And then Moses comes in. I argue it's because there's an impending jailbreak. They are going to be brought out of exile, just like Moses brought them out of the bondage in Egypt. They are going to be brought out of exile as well. Moses is the comforting presence. It's the reminder that when our Israelite people, were in captivity before, Yahweh saved us. I am the Lord your God who led you out of Egypt from the house of bondage. Now, if you keep my commands, you will be my royal priesthood, my treasured possession above all nations. That's Exodus 19, the beginning of the covenant formulation. And so here now, they are awaiting a new Moses moment. They're awaiting a new Exodus to come out of Babylon back to the land that belongs to them. So, Moses may or may not have written it. But in either case, the psalm is associated with Moses. So whether it's by authorship or by editorial comment, not my editorial comment, that should say by editorial comment, the editor has chosen to, right after the question, will God be faithful, bring Moses in and say, of course, God was faithful before in bringing you out of captivity. God will do so again. So I think that's what's going on there with Psalm 90 and Moses. It's so much more elegant if this is actually a poem of Moses that has been incorporated into the Psalms. But it would mean the same kind of thing if they were to say this is the Mosaic Psalm, if you will, or it's attributed to the Mosaic paradigm of the Exodus. So what about genres we see in Book 4? We're seeing pretty heavy praise. Remember, the first 3 books were very heavy on the lament, and now we're seeing praise. In fact, we can go back to our trusty dusty Logos Bible software. We can, at this point, it's now probably seeming like I'm being paid by Logos to talk about their software. It is not the case. I am not on the payroll for them. There are plenty of things that I have about Logos that I would complain about. I won't do that right now. But yeah, if we look at, genre for the Psalms, here we go. You can see that there. So Book 1, heavy on the lament. Book 2, heavy on the lament. Book 3, heavy on the lament. Book 4, now we see praise. Praise has come up as the dominant emotion. And again, we have the laments of David. We have in books 1 and 2. You can see David. David's psalms are mostly. It seems like the majority are lament psalms. Certainly the plurality. I believe the majority are all lament psalms. So you see that through the first few books. Then you get to book 3. You get the descent into exile, and now you have the coming out of exile in book 4, and you begin to see the praise. And then, as we'll talk about later, book 5 is very, very positive. So that's what we're dealing with genre-wise in book 4. And then here's our word clouds. So the themes from book 4, I actually want to go compare this. So book 3, if you want a little bit more commentary on book 3, I'd go to the book 3 video where we talked through this cloud. We specifically honed in on the word forever and its relationship to the Davidic covenant and the question about forever and whether or not the covenant will last forever. But we see Lord and God, we see hand and people, book 3. If you look at book 4, so we have Lord and God again. We have people, again, now the theme of the people, they're being mentioned more often. But we can see some of these other words. Praise is relatively high up there. Earth, sing. We can look here. We don't see sing anywhere. There's not that much singing going on in book 3. Earth is, you do see Earth right here, but it's got a higher profile here in book 4. The day, the land, and this is interesting. You see land, you see the discussion about the king. There's not that much talk about the land here. The restoration of the land in the return from exile is something that that comes through more in this part of the Psalms. So there's nothing really in particular that I want to hone in on this time on the word cloud, but there is one thing we need to talk about for book 3, which is the theme of the kingship of Yahweh. So there's a segment in here, Psalms 93 and then 95 through 99 are as a unit thought of as something called enthronement psalms. So they're celebrating Yahweh's reign over the whole earth. There's some similarities here to what we see in 2nd Isaiah. So 2nd Isaiah is the section of Isaiah from Isaiah 40 through 55. So if Isaiah has 66 chapters, 1 through 39 is often thought of as first Isaiah, 40 through 55 second, and then 56 through 66 third. Isaiah 1 through 39 goes all the way up to Hezekiah, and it goes up to Sennacherib in Assyria, and the sort of saving of Israel from the armies of Assyria that had surrounded them. Isaiah 40 and then 40 through 48 then specifically address the Babylonian exile. And so you see Cyrus is mentioned. Chapter 40, we're pretty much familiar with that from Handel's Messiah. Comfort, comfort ye my people, says your God. And that's speaking to an exilic audience. So this middle section in Isaiah is to the exiles. And there's a lot of commonality that we see between this part of the Psalms and what we see in 2nd Isaiah, which is situated both during and then coming out of the exile. And so towards the end of that, we see a common repeated element in the Psalms, Yahweh reigns, and which is similar to something we see in 2nd Isaiah, which is about the redemption of Jerusalem. We're probably familiar with this from some of our hymns, but how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. This whole concept of your God reigns is also tremendously important to the exiles and to those coming out. The question of whether or not their God was actually in charge, or whether or not their God had abandoned them or was no longer able, maybe Yahweh can't actually fulfill all the promises that Yahweh has been giving us for as long as we've been around. For them to come out of exile, for them to return to Jerusalem, for them to be able to rebuild the temple. So, the one who goes up to the mountain on Zion, it says, your God reigns. That's the faithfulness of Yahweh, the proof that Yahweh is who he says he is, and will, in fact, be faithful to his covenant. So we see this, the Lord reigns, come through quite often. In fact, rather than derail, we'll stick with that. There's another reminiscent thing, and I was looking for the origin of this, because I suspect it's around this time, but that's purely just a suspicion. There's a prelude, I called it a common prelude. I believe almost like all Jewish prayers begin with this same formulation, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. We praise you, Lord our God, Yahweh our God, King of the universe. So this idea of the enthronement of Yahweh over everybody, over everything. The Lord reigns over the entire world. That's a theme that we see a lot in these enthronement psalms, which take up a good chunk of what you see in Book 4. So Yahweh's kingship now is Yahweh's covenant faithfulness was called into question towards the end of Book 3. And now Book 4, Yahweh's exalted. Yahweh's, we're trusting the heck out of Yahweh. And that's happening even more so in Book 5, actually. So, this is a strong theme in both the exilic and the post-exilic passages in Isaiah and in Book 4 of the Psalms. I could have written Book 5. God has, in fact, been faithful to his covenant. He's triumphed over the idols of the nations. In the enthronement Psalms, you see a lot of the derision of the idols. We talked about that in the Divine Council video from last time. Israel has been restored to its rightful place as Yahweh's servants, and this is an occasion for much rejoicing. There's a lot more praise that we see in Book 4 than we see elsewhere. So here's the theological question that comes from this. What do we think it means that the theme of Yahweh's kingship comes right on the heels of Psalm 89, the question of the failure of the Davidic covenant? I've talked about it many times so far, and I've mentioned the fact that it does. Indeed above, I'm pointing to one aspect of it, which is that God has been faithful to his covenant. The question was, will God be faithful? The answer is yes, God will be faithful. But you can talk about the faithfulness of God without talking about the kingship of God. What does it mean that the kingship of Yahweh is emphasized after the collapse of the monarchy? So the answer to that, I think, and I expect many people who attend this evening will get it. Was Yahweh happy about King Saul? Remember how the monarchy came about in the first place. To crudely paraphrase it, it was Samuel talking to Yahweh about the people who wanted a king like the other nations, and it essentially went like, ugh, if you insist, I suppose. Yahweh was the king. And eventually, the Israelites demanded a king. Then they got one, and it didn't work out too well. They were led astray because Yahweh was not their king. The kingship of Yahweh being emphasized after the discussion of the failure of the Davidic covenant shows that, in a sense, they learned their lesson. Yahweh is the king. They do not need a human ruler because Yahweh is their ruler. And so I think there's, throughout the strain of the history of Israel and the monarchical period that then collapsed into failure, and now this restoration that comes afterwards, where Yahweh is situated as the king, I believe that is intentional. I believe that's strongly intentional. So there's just a bit of theology that you can see in the progression of the Psalms. Now, there are also in these enthronement Psalms many parallels to ancient Near Eastern literature. For instance, Yahweh defeats chaos. And Ryan does his animations poorly. So Yahweh defeats chaos. This is kind of like how Baal defeats the chaos waters of Yam in one of the Ugaritic myths. Yahweh rides a chariot victoriously in the clouds. Same is said of Baal in another one of the Ugaritic texts. Marduk, an ancient Near Eastern god, is said to ride a chariot in battle against chaos. Yahweh establishes his throne on a sacred mountain. The palace of Baal is constructed on a mountain as well. It has a window from which the heavenly waters can stream down to earth. There's also some parallels. Hassa Bullock mentions it, and then the Zondervan International Bible Background Commentary. John Walton edited it. I forget who wrote that part. Talk about parallels that are seen with this hymn to Aten, who created mankind and cattle and every sort of beast. So the creator of all living things. So there's some specific parallels that we're seeing in these hymns about Yahweh that seem to match other ancient Near Eastern literature as well. So what do we make of the usage of ancient Near Eastern material in the Psalms? Does it cause confusion or doubt? Is it unexpected? I will admit that, so first off, depending upon the way this is positioned, my position is that this can be positioned very lazily. Somebody can just say, well, look, there are parallels, therefore the Hebrew literature is just a different culture's expression of a particular strain of thought on how the world worked. So the Canaanites had theirs, the Egyptians had theirs, and the Israelites had theirs. It's all roughly the same story. Each one had different gods with slightly different attributes between them, but it's all the same thing. That's the conclusion I think if you were to go to most seminaries and you were to take Old Testament history, it's essentially what you're going to get. That these are different in degree, not different in kind. Laughable, truly, if you read the texts themselves. It's a gut buster for somebody to try and say that with a straight face. At the same time, though, these parallels do exist. They are talking about the same sorts of things. There is shared commonality. And so, to the question, is it unexpected? I don't think it's at all unexpected. because the texts are indeed bound culturally. But does it cause some confusion or doubt? Sure. I don't see why it wouldn't. First time that I heard about it, I had no clue what to make of it. I was like, yeah, that does look actually pretty similar. Uh, but the similarities and the contrast therein could be the point. So I want to look at this further. I want us to keep this in mind too. The theology of the Bible is the same that it's always been. What's difficult when we approach something like this, especially when we put texts, ancient Near Eastern texts side by side with the Bible, is getting ourselves in the mindset of an ancient Israelite rather than the mindset of a 21st century American, or wherever you may be, a 21st century person, wherever you happen to be watching this from, in understanding that theology, because it's wrapped up in the idiom of the people at the time. So I've chosen Psalm 104 as an illustration of how we're going to work through these parallels. So let's go through these examples and let's talk about this problem. So Psalm 104, we're going to go ahead and read Psalm 104. Let's see, I might actually be able to just do it right here. We'll click into Psalm 104. We're going to get through to the parallelism. We're going to... do we want to keep the structure? Yeah, let's keep the structure. Okay, so here we go. All right. So let all that I am praise Yahweh. O Yahweh, my God, how great you are. You are robed with honor and majesty. You are dressed in a robe of light. You stretch out the starry curtain of the heavens. You lay out the rafters of your home in the rain clouds. You make the clouds your chariot. You ride upon the wings of the wind. The winds are your messengers. Flames of fire are your servants. You placed the world on its foundation so it would never be moved. You clothed the earth with floods of water, water that covered even the mountains. At your command the water fled. At the sound of your thunder it hurried away. Mountains rose and valleys sank to the levels that you decreed. Then you set a firm boundary for the seas so that they would never again cover the earth. You make springs pour water into the ravines so streams gush down from the mountains. They provide water for all the animals, and the wild donkeys quench their thirst. The birds nest beside the streams and sing among the branches of the trees. You send rain on the mountains from your heavenly home, and you fill the earth with the fruit of your labor. You cause grass to grow for the livestock and plants for people to use. You allow them to produce food from the earth. Wine to make them glad, olive oil to soothe their skin, and bread to give them strength. The trees of Yahweh are well cared for, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. There the birds make their nests, and the storks make their homes in the cypresses. High in the mountains live the wild goats, and the rocks form a refuge for the hyraxes. You made the moon to mark the seasons, the sun knows when to set. You send the darkness, and it becomes night, and when all the forest animals prowl about. Then the young lions roar for their prey, stalking the food provided by God. At dawn they slink back into their dens and rest. Then people go off to their work, where they labor until evening. O Yahweh, what a variety of things you have made, in wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the ocean, vast and wide, teeming with life of every kind, both large and small. See the ships sailing along, and Leviathan, which you made to play in the sea. They all depend on you to give them food as they need it. When you supply it, they gather it. You open your hand to feed them, they are richly satisfied. But if you turn away from them, they panic. When you take away their breath, they die and turn to dust. When you give them your breath, life is created, and you renew the face of the earth. May the glory of Yahweh continue forever, Yahweh who takes pleasure in all he has made. The earth trembles at his glance, the mountains smoke at his touch. I will sing to Yahweh as long as I live, I will praise my God to my last breath. May all my thoughts be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in Yahweh. Let all sinners vanish from the face of the earth, let the wicked disappear forever, let all I am praise Yahweh, praise Yahweh. The word of the Lord. Okay. So there we go. So who's the speaker? Let's go through our questions. We're familiar with them right now. And I say it every time. The questions themselves are they don't tell you what the psalm means, but the questions are a place to start. It can help you get your bearings on wherever you're at with the particular psalm, and at least set you on a direction to go find the interesting things within the psalm. So, who is the speaker then in this one? So there's no attribution in the Masoretic text. This would be an anonymous psalm. The Septuagint mentions David, which is unlikely. In other words, we don't know. There are many thoughts about how this might have been used in worship, but if it was used in worship, it was used by one of the priests or the Levites in the temple, and there's nothing further aside from that we can ascertain about the speaker. Is it personal or corporate? So, it's a good question. Remember, the mark of the personal psalms are the personal pronouns, I, me, my. And this does appear to be a personal prayer. We do see the personal pronouns used in the opening and the closing lines. So the psalmist is speaking on behalf of himself when praying this, because there's the exhorting to personal praise that comes out of it. So genre-wise then, is this praise? Is it lament, thanksgiving, trust, or royal psalm? This is going to fall into the praise category. I think that's pretty clear. In fact, along with Psalms 8, 19, 29, and 148, this is considered a creation hymn of praise. It's probably not that surprising given what we just read, because it all seems to be about creation. So it's definitely a way of attributing praise to God, and it's mentioning the creation, and the creation is the reason for the praise. And so we're seeing that in Psalms 8, 19, 29, 148 as well. Now, Derek Kidner, in the Tyndale series, and actually when I wrote this, that was the only one I was familiar with. Dr. Bullock also does it right here in his Teach the Text commentary. He identifies allusions to all the main created elements in Genesis chapter 1, found in Psalm 104. So I've put together on here the elements from Genesis 1. So there's light, the separation of the waters of heaven from the waters on earth, the distinguishing between the land and water, vegetation and trees, lights that separate day and night, creatures of the sea and the air, animals and man, and then the food being given to them. Now, this is taken almost fully from Derek Kidner's chart that he put in the Tyndale commentary series. What we're going to do in the class tonight is start to look for where these parallels exist. But right now we can go through them. So in terms of let there be light, we see this in Psalm 102 in verse 2a. So you see right in here, so you are dressed in a robe of light. So that would be the parallel that is identified at least by Derek Kidner there. And then likewise, the Hasselbullock here in the Teach the Text commentary, page 235, is looking at the light parallel. Yahweh wraps himself in light as with a garment, verse 2a. So the separation of the waters of heaven from the waters on the earth. So if we look at, in fact, I'm going to Genesis 1:6, we'll pull that up right here. So, and God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water, and God called the vault sky. So if we look at the New Revised Standard right here, so let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. I think it's interesting, and we're going to come back to this, I promise you. The word here, dome, and then the word vault. In fact, we can, it doesn't look like you can see my overlay here. But yeah, it would be referred to as like the firmament. And if we dig into the word study here real quick and the way that it's used, it is the underlying word. It talks about either a beaten metal plate or a bow. uh, and then, yeah, the firmament or the dome of heaven. So where do we see that in Psalm 104? You see that come right afterwards. So you stretch the starry curtain of the heavens, you lay out the rafters of your home in the rain clouds. And then also in verse 3, yeah, so the rafters, the other thing that you can look at there, the translation I was using when I built this, beams of your tent on the waters. So that's interesting. Verses 5 through 9, you place the world on its foundation, so it would never be moved. You set the firm boundary for the seas so they would never again cover the earth. We'll get to that actually in just a bit. I'm skipping ahead. So land and water distinguished then. So Genesis 1:9. So God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And then in Psalm 104, we have verses 5 and 6. If you place the world on its foundation so it would never be moved, you clothed the earth with the floods of water that it covered even the mountains. And then going even further, at your rebuke the water fled. So when we're talking about the separation of the land and the water, so at your rebuke the waters fled. So everything recessed away. They went down into the valleys. And then you set a boundary they cannot cross. So they will never again cover the earth. So there's that separation between the waters and the land, just like is discussed in Genesis, where you have the water under the sky gathered in one place and dry ground appearing. Vegetation and trees in Genesis, verse 11, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds, and it was so. So we see this in verses 14 through 17. He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for people to cultivate. The trees of Yahweh are well watered. The cedars of Lebanon, etc. So once again, we're seeing the same sort of thing. So the lights that separate the day and night, the planets as timekeepers, is the way that Dr. Bullock puts it. So in verse 14 in Genesis, God said, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. So that's a good enough description of that. What do we see in Psalm 104? Starting in verse 19. Go down to verse 19. So you made the moon to mark the seasons and the sun to know when to set. I mean, this is deliberate borrowing that we're seeing here. They're the same language that's used in Genesis is being pulled into this hymn of creation that's being sung as part of an enthronement psalm for Yahweh. The creatures of the sea and the air. So let the water teem with living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth and across the vault of the sky. That's from Genesis 1:20 through 23. And then you have the sea teeming with life as well. There's in Psalm 104. There's a sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There's ships to go to and fro, and Leviathan, whom you formed to frolic there. So the creation of animals and man, we see those Genesis 1:24. God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. Then we see all throughout, really, this psalm, and there's many more than just this 21 through 24 that I called out on the PowerPoint presentation. But we have water given to the beasts of the field and the wild donkeys in verse 11. We have the high mountains that belong to the goats, and the crags are for the hyrax in verse 18. All the beasts of the forest in verse 20. You have the lions roaring for their prey in verse 21. And then we have in verse 24, if we pull that through here in Logos, so what a variety of things you have made. In your wisdom you've made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. That's similar to that 8 hymn that we looked at. And then finally, food appointed. So everybody depends upon God for food in verses 26 and 27 in Psalm 104. And then In Genesis 1:29 through 30, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. So we can see it over and over again in this sequence. It's actually following pretty close to the sequence in Psalm 104 as well. There's a question I have. Do you buy it? You have the right to say no. Because some of this stuff, especially like dressed in the robe of light, let there be light, okay. Some of these seem pretty clearly borrowed. I would say like the lights that separate the day and night. It's almost impossible to say that that's not borrowed. But I'm going to say that there is a tendency within biblical scholarship to overplay your hand, so to speak, on parallels. It can turn into a bit of a the idiom that's coming to mind is a Procrustean bed, which is it's a story of Procrustes, an ancient Greek mythical innkeeper, who, when guests complained that the bed was either too large or too small, for the ones who said it was too large, he would chop their limbs off to fit the bed, and the ones who said it was too small, he would chop their limbs off. The ones who said it was too large, he would stretch them. There is it's kind of a gruesome story, but then again, a lot of those myths were. But the grotesque imagery, I think, is appropriate to what some scholars do in forcing parallels. It's just a complete dismemberment of the text in order to fit a pre-existing theory. So that's the bed of Procrustes analogy. And so I do think that sometimes that's the case. But in this one, what I will say is that there are certainly creation parallels. So it's clearly dependent upon the Genesis 1 account, but it's also not a direct retelling of the Genesis 1 account. There are some differences, some things that you find in Genesis that aren't in Psalm 104 that aren't necessarily in Genesis. And in fact, so most commentators also see parallels to, other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, as we've already seen. This psalm here appears to be addressing, or at least involving, these prevalent myths in the cultures around them, and asserting the kingship of Yahweh over and above the other gods. We talked about this last week in the Divine Council bit as well, such that the other gods were brought into the discussion for the sake of contrast. So, another example of this would be in Acts chapter 17. So this is Paul. He goes to Athens. He's talking to the Athenians, and he's talking about Jesus and the resurrection. They haul him up to the Areopagus, and when he is giving his proclamation of the gospel to them, he actually uses some of their own poetry. So just to quote from the middle of that, his purpose, that's Yahweh's purpose, was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. And since this is true, we shouldn't think of God as an idol designed by craftsmen from gold or silver or stone. So Paul is trying to let them know that the God that he's talking about is living, and he's appealing to their sensibilities. He's saying, even your own poets say, we are his offspring. If we are his offspring, that implies that God is living, because stone or gold or silver idols don't have offspring. So when they're bringing we are his offspring, now who would they be referring to? In this particular case, they're likely referring to Zeus. And so one of the interesting questions to ask then, and this is a bit of is it a bit of entrapment? Perhaps. I'm pulling this particular question from Scott Oliphant. He's a professor of apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary. And he himself admits that it's a bit of a trick question. But on this particular point, he asks his class sometimes, so when the Greeks wrote, we are his offspring, was that true? So Paul is quoting and incorporating the argument from their poets. We are his offspring. Was that a true statement? And at least the way that they were using it, no. We're not Zeus's offspring. And Baal did not defeat the chaos monster and then build his temple upon the, the dome. Uh, but when Paul says it, is it true? So this is, follow where this is going here. Paul in Athens borrows cultural material from the Athenians. There is no question at any point in time as to whether or not Paul believes it's true or false. Paul doesn't believe in any of the poems as being metaphysically or ontologically true. He's not giving any credibility to the idea that we are Zeus's offspring. But he is saying that, he's trying to speak using the idiom of the people to say that we are in fact Yahweh's offspring. And these idols that you have here are clearly not gods of any sort. So when Paul uses it to talk about Yahweh, it is true. But when it was originally written, it was untrue the way it was intended. So it's true in a way that they didn't intend it, but it's false in the way that they did intend it. I think that's the same thing that's going on here in terms of the borrowing from the ancient Near Eastern traditions. And so what I want to look at, though, is let's drill down into specifically the claims that are being made in Psalm 104. Let's look at them specifically. So, first of all, we see in verse 3, the heavens are stretched out like a tent, beams of chambers on waters. Let me verify that quote here real quick, because I suspect a typo on my part in this one. Let's see, you lay out the rafters of your home in the rain clouds. That's not the translation I was using. You set the beams of your chambers on the waters. Okay. No, I just abbreviated it. The heavens are stretched out like a tent. The beams of chambers are on the waters. So I just abbreviated it. All right. What is this saying? This implies that God has a dwelling place that is structurally held up above the waters. And we might say, well, this is metaphorical language, except that it's consistent. It's consistently applied throughout, as we'll see when we get further. It's not just a one-off. This is the language that's used everywhere, and this is also the language you see in the ancient Near East for the other gods. So, earth has a foundation, like a building, so that it will never be shaken. So there's a foundation laid for the earth. Now, one question here, for the real literalists out there. Does this mean that the Bible is in error because there are earthquakes? After all, the Bible says it will never be shaken, but there are earthquakes, so the earth is shaken. And then you have somebody come in, well, I mean, that's just tectonic plates. That's not the earth itself being shaken. It's like, oh my goodness, please. That is not what's being said here. First of all, the Bible itself, even earlier in the Psalms, talks about earthquakes. It also talks about earthquakes in the New Testament. It talks about earthquakes becoming bigger. When it talks about a foundation for the earth, this makes sense in the context of the whole universe, the whole cosmic geography of the ancient people, as we will see. But earthquakes were not understood to be tectonic activity. Earthquakes were, they started with God. God was the one who was bringing the earth. So God is allowed to do whatever to the world. But the earth itself does not have a shaky foundation. This would just be perceiving the fact that the earth itself appears to be stable, and that God is the one who set it there. There are waters above the mountains, is another claim. Verse 6. You cover it, that's the earth, with the deep, as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. So we have a physical boundary that prevents these waters also from flooding the earth again. That's in verse 9. If we look at verse 9, so you set a boundary so that that's the waters, may not pass, so they might not again cover the earth. So once again, we're seeing this idea that there's some sort of boundary that's between the waters and the earth. God controls the waters above and gives rainwater down the mountains to the vegetation. We've talked about this a little bit with the allusions to Genesis, but verse 13, from your lofty abode you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. So there's waters above that give rainwater down the mountains to the vegetation. The sun and moon, as we've gone over already, mark the seasons and days. The sea is vast. It has innumerable creatures in it, including our new friend Leviathan. This is an actual photograph of Leviathan. He's the nephew of the Loch Ness Monster. Okay, I'm being facetious here. But interesting that there is a named creature in here. And I want to dig into this a little bit more because this is one of these examples of the parallels you find with ancient Near Eastern literature. Who is Leviathan? So, for instance, before we get to that, though, does this make any more sense? After all, who's that? When we looked at this, okay, we're talking about mountains. We're talking about waters above. We're talking about the land. We're looking at pillars. And then what's this like monster thing down here? That's our new friend Leviathan. And the Leviathan shows up in other parts of the Bible. Isaiah 27:1. On that day, the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. This is another one of those things, sort of like the divine council and Yahweh appearing before the gods, where you're flipping through the Bible, you're reading, oh, that's nice, I have no idea what it means, and you just keep going, because it doesn't fit the categories that we have, because we're not ancient people, and we don't see the world the way that ancient people do. Hold on, I need to fix the light balance here. So we have Leviathan, this chaos monster that inhabits the deep, mentioned 5 times, twice in Job, once in Isaiah, and twice in the Psalms. You also have another one, Rahab, which is another monster in the sea that represents chaos. When it talks about the water or the Spirit of God hovering over the deep, those are the waters of chaos. And so we have this particular inhabitant of chaos mentioned a few times. Yahweh's not the only one who apparently defeats Leviathan. Baal defeats Leviathan as well in Ugaritic myth. Merikare in Egyptian mythology defeats the water monster during the act of creation. Marduk defeats Tiamat, the chaos goddess of the sea in the Enuma Elish. That's an ancient Near Eastern epic that we are familiar with. I think it's the earliest one that we have. So, here's the question. Does this mean that the ancient biblical authors were borrowing from ancient Near Eastern myths when telling the story of Yahweh? That's an interesting question, right? Because when you look at this kind of parallel and you look at it in the Bible, you can say to yourself, I don't know, maybe are they talking about mythology the same way that these others were talking about mythology, and the only reason they're talking about a sea monster is because other people were talking about sea monsters, and there's what is really going on here? And I think it's a worthwhile question. After all, the text is culture bound, and they're using language that others would indeed understand because they would have the same categories. Certainly, the Canaanites and the Egyptians would understand if they talked about Leviathan. However, Isaiah 27:1, and please forgive me for the sake of time that we don't go into the whole exposition of this. Isaiah chapter 27 is actually talking about the oppressors of Judah as being the forces of chaos. That Leviathan is standing in for the powers that are oppressing Judah, the southern kingdom at the time. and I'm just putting all the references here, New American Commentary, Lexham Bible Dictionary, Tyndale Commentary, John Calvin's commentary, or all four that I looked at. And if you read the whole thing in context, you see how that's playing out. That the forces that are opposing the people of God at the time are being mythologically or analogously described as, the forces of chaos, which in the idiom at the time would be understood as the Leviathan. When they're talking about it in Job, and Rahab and Leviathan in the deep, God is talking to Job and saying, essentially, where were you when I did all of these things, including tamed Leviathan? And so that's speaking to Job and the others in the time in categories that they would understand about where were you when I brought order out of chaos. So it is not uncommon for the Bible to refer to pagan mythology for the sake of contrast or illustration. And so in Psalm 104, Yahweh creating order from chaos, which is what it's talking about. That's the whole idea behind Leviathan. Is not the point of this story. The story is that of creation. Yahweh drawing order out of chaos is being symbolized as the victory over the forces of chaos, incorporated into the prayer of the people, using the language that they would understand, and that involves, vanquishing the sea monster. So it's important to understand that when these figures of speech are being introduced, they're not being introduced necessarily as metaphysical concepts, but as illustrative concepts. Leviathan is about as minor a character as you can get in the Bible. It's not a big point. Leviathan is not stand-in for Satan. Leviathan is invoked to talk only in the context of the waters of chaos out of which God called the world. So it's symbolic in the sense, and this is just the way that people talked at the time when you were talking about creating order out of chaos. And so it's using the idiom of the people in order to speak to the people, to communicate to them, according to their culture and their understanding, what God had accomplished. And so we have to understand that the text, the form of the text, is bound up in a particular culture, and it's up to us to try and understand that. So I want to look specifically at ancient cosmology to try and illustrate this better. So let's go through, here's kind of a view of ancient Near Eastern cosmology. I think I might have shown this in class once before, but we'll go through each one of these. However, if you ever hear, and I have used the term before, if you've ever heard of the concept of the three-tiered universe, this is it. This is your three-tiered universe. You have the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the waters below. And then that everything else kind of revolves around those three tiers of the universe. So you start with the heavens. So that's all the way up top here, God's dwelling place. This is all courtesy of Logos Bible software. But the heavens and the heaven of heavens are the domain of God and the angels. They're above the solid firmament. So you can see the firmament on the left side here, all the way in this dome, the water's above the firmament, and then you have God in the heaven of heavens. So then you have the waters above. You can see this says waters above the firmament right there. The commentary here is helpful. Called a sea of glass in Revelation 4:6 and a pavement of sapphire in Exodus 24:9. This expanse of crystal clear water forms the foundation of heaven. So heaven is set upon this foundation. Psalm 104:3 says Yahweh sets the beams in the waters for his upper chambers. And Psalm 23:9 says that Yahweh's voice thunders from over the waters. So again, the folks at Logos here are borrowing or using Psalm 104 as an illustration of this. This is a psalm we're looking at where the beams are set for Yahweh's abode in the waters. So if Yahweh lives above the waters, the the foundation is quite literally set there. Um, and there's a couple other references here. So Ezekiel 1:26, the shape of a throne with the appearance of sapphire stone was above the expanse. This Ezekiel's having a vision at the very beginning. This is part of his commissioning. So the shape of a throne with the appearance of sapphire stone was above the expanse. There was a form with the appearance of a human on the throne high above. And so this sapphire stone represents or is the illustration of these waters above. Exodus 24:9 through 10, that Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of Israel's elders, and they saw the God of Israel. Beneath his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire stone, as clear as the sky itself. This is once again the illustration of the idea of the abode of God being on the waters above. So then the firmament. The sky was viewed as a vaulted dome, or firmament resting on its foundations at its edges, perhaps mountains, with doors and windows that let in the rain. This hard dome separated the waters above from the waters below. So if we remember here, there's waters below, and then there's waters above, and the dome is the thing that's separating the waters from the waters. This just brings us right back to Genesis 1:6. Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. If you've ever wanted to know what that means, this is what it's talking about. This is the ancient Near Eastern conception of the universe. It's yet another one of those things where you read through and you're like, that's nice, I have no idea what that means, but I'll keep going to the let there be light because I understand what that means. So a dome or a vault in the midst of the waters, separating water from water. If you imagine that there's no earth here, you just have a ball of water. And this view is going to be created. You're going to get this vaulted dome, this dry space. And so in Isaiah 40:22 as well, God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. His inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like thin cloth and spreads them out like a tent to live in. So, we're seeing this whole idea. There's this circle of the earth. They didn't have satellites. They don't know what the blue earth looks like. So we have to put this in context of the way that they think about it. So then you have the earth. The world was viewed as a disk floating on the waters, secured or moored by pillars. Psalm 136:6 says the earth is spread out above the waters. Then you have the great deep, the primordial ocean, described. So Genesis 1:2, Psalm 74. In Job 26, Job describes how Yahweh inscribed a circle on the surface of the water, stilled by the sea, and defeated Rahab, a mythical sea monster, all in the process of creating the earth. Also see Psalm 89. Indeed, Psalm 89, if we were to look at that, does mention another one of our sea monster friends. It should be, you crushed Rahab like a carcass. Back. You crushed Rahab like a carcass, you scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. Are the Israelites really saying here that they believe that there is, or said differently, is the Bible telling us that there is in fact a sea monster underneath the world? No. They're using the idiom of the people to describe what happened, where God is the one who brings order out of chaos. Then you have Sheol. So the underworld Sheol was a watery or dusty prison from which no one returned. Regarded as a physical place beneath the earth, it could only be reached through death. So the underworld, essentially, if you recall that from Greek history class or ancient Roman mythology. So Sheol, the underworld, Orpheus and Eurydice, that whole idea, crossing the river Styx to the realm of the dead. That was the way that they conceived of it. The underworld is where people went after they died. You can only get there through death. You put people in the ground and they disintegrate. They enter Sheol. at that point. And this is what you see in the Hebrew Bible. So let's take a quick digression on the concept of Sheol. Is Sheol the same thing as hell? No, it's not. The unfortunate KJV translations, being what they are, they translated Sheol as hell in the King James Bible. That would be incorrect. When you see Hades in the New Testament, that is also not hell. That is the realm, the realm of the dead. Gehenna, on the other hand, is different. We'll get to that in just a minute. The ancient Israelites did not have a concept of what we call hell. That is just true. There's nowhere in the Old Testament, save for one place, that even hints at something like that. Is Sheol the same thing as heaven? No. The ancient Israelites had no concept of either reward or punishment after death. That is not the way that they thought of their existence. It was about who they were at that time. There's no place, you read through the Sinai Covenant, you read through the Torah. There isn't anywhere where it talks about what happens to you after death. It's all about what happens to you right now. The heavens, according to them, were the dwelling place of God. That's just where God lived. It's about, the heavens are just, where God is. Not where you go after you die if you're good. And there is no idea of hell where you go when things go bad. So Sheol is another world where everyone went after death. Whether you were an Israelite or a Canaanite, you went to Sheol. Whether you were neither of those, you went to Sheol. If you were, Abraham went to Sheol. So, Noah, Enoch, not so sure about. But, the whole idea is that the realm of the dead is pretty uninteresting and not... it just is. It neither is punishment nor is it reward. So there is no expectation of a future life with God even until Daniel 12. And even there it's not nearly described the way that we see it in the New Testament. Here's the quote. Many of those whose bodies lie dead and buried will rise up, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting disgrace. Okay, this is really just talking about a resurrection. But everlasting life and shame and everlasting disgrace isn't heaven and hell. It implies resurrection and judgment. You can see, though, you can forgive the Sadducees for, given the texts that they had in the Hebrew Bible, saying, we maybe don't understand what this means, and there's nowhere else. Moses never talked about a resurrection or a life after death or whatnot. And so, maybe we're just reading this passage wrong. But this is all you get in the Old Testament. You get, many of those whose bodies lie dead and buried will rise up, which is resurrection, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting disgrace. There may also be an idea, now that I'm thinking of it, and if you permit me a quick detour, there may be a little bit at the end of Isaiah here. Heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. All these things my hand has made. Let's keep going. We want to go to the very end here. So they shall bring from all your kindred, from all the nations, an offering to the Lord on horses, chariots, and litters, on dormitories, my holy mountain Jerusalem, says the Lord, just as the Israelites will bring a grain offering. For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your descendants in your name remain. For new moon to new moon, Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord. And they shall go out and look among the dead bodies of people who rebelled against me, for their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and there shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. The interesting thing here is For as the new heavens and new earth which I will make shall remain before me, so shall your descendants and your name remain. It doesn't talk about you or resurrection. So there is your descendants will remain forever in the new heavens and the new earth. And then there's the people who rebelled, who have a different faith, or fate, excuse me. But it doesn't speak explicitly of resurrection. So Sheol is different than our idea. The Sinai covenant was never about eternal destiny. It was about the identification of Israel as God's royal priesthood, who would receive blessing right here, right now, for obedience, and cursing right here, right now, for disobedience. Except for Daniel 12, there's not really an insinuation about individual post-mortem judgment. It's a corporate struggle. Nations are either blessed or cursed. And so one of the things that I thought about when I was reading through this, and I just want to share it, how do you think it affects behavior when your identity is that you were born into the chosen people of God? Assume you're an Israelite. As you begin to learn about the world, you were born into the chosen people of God. This life is what you get until the netherworld, but your conduct affects your family and nation right now. Blessing or cursing depends upon corporate obedience, of which you are part. And then you eventually are going to go to Sheol with everybody else. How does that contrast with the idea of individual post-mortem judgment? There's something about it that I think the New Testament gives us a different view than this, which would be the concept of progressive revelation. Also, New Covenant. And under the different covenantal structure, you're allowed to, it's like a new constitution, so to speak. But if you're an Israelite, there's something enormously majestic about Yahweh, who's been there since Moses, through all of your ancestors, and will be there through all your descendants. And when you read the places like in Job, man that is born of a woman has but a short time to live and is full of misery. He cometh up and is cut down like a flower. And that's the way that they thought kind of about themselves, that they come up and they're cut down, but Yahweh is there the whole time. And yet I was born into this chosen race, and my conduct matters not just for me and my own personal judgment, but for the obedience or disobedience of the nation, and the fate of our nation, and our blessing or our cursing for what's going to happen. I have that responsibility not just for myself, but I have a corporate responsibility. And anything that happens after me could be the result of my personal obedience or disobedience. It's interesting when it's like it's not you responsible for yourself, but you're responsible for other people. It reminds me of so some of you may or may not know. So I am a fan of the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson, and he has in his 12 rules for life, one of them is care for yourself like you are somebody worth taking care of. It's a paraphrase of it, but he goes through the interesting phenomenon that in the book where people care for others better than they care for themselves, and they don't treat themselves like somebody who deserves to be treated well. And it's really kind of fascinating, and it just made me kind of think of that if you are, people are more likely to treat, you're going to treat life differently if you feel like you're only affecting yourself, versus if your actions could have negative consequences for others, then you act differently. And so your moral character in the Jewish milieu can affect other people and can in fact affect the nation. We have individualized eschatology. We've made it about just me. And we don't really think that whatever I do could have ramifications for the nation. But it does. It so tremendously does. the character of individuals is so vitally important for the survival of a country, or a nation state, or a people, or a community, or whatever it is. And the Jewish people understood that. They may have had a different, covenantal idea of it that doesn't apply anymore, but that doesn't mean that the individual character doesn't affect the group. Of course it does. This is, broken window theory. Or an example that I like to use is when, so the place where I work involves a warehouse. The warehouse is spick and span, perfectly clean. And we clean it every single day. Every person actually is involved in cleaning it. There's some departments that the last 15 minutes of the day, all they do is clean. It's on the receiving side because that's where they get all the junk. You have to dispose of packaging like crazy. When you notice that everybody else is cleaned up and the place is aesthetically beautiful and has been organized and a lot of people have put effort into it, or so whether it's at the warehouse or a more accessible analogy would be on a golf course, you feel bad if you're the one who tosses their wrapper and just throws it on the floor. It's the only thing that's out of place. It looks horrible. It looks ugly. If you take a styrofoam cup or a beer can or something and throw it on the green at a golf course, people are going to get upset. Now if you go someplace where, like a public beach, maybe, where everybody's just been dumping trash everywhere, you don't feel so bad about the fact that, there's, if you leave your trash. Everybody else did it. This place has become a place where trash is allowed just to be everywhere. And yet, to achieve that, it takes a conspiracy of individuals in both cases. If all the individuals decided to clean up or to litter, you create this, this self-perpetuating culture. And so, there is something that is more direct about the Jewish understanding here, on the impact on the community of individual character than an overly individualized eschatology. Now, it's the New Testament that introduces the idea of individual accountability for sin. This is throughout the Sermon on the Mount, for instance. Like, it is better to go into heaven with one hand than into Gehenna with two hands. Gehenna was a valley near Jerusalem, used often as a site of idolatry during the Old Testament period, and is used to describe the lake of fire that awaits the wicked in the New Testament. So there is the idea of individual accountability. Now, if you've ever heard the idea that there was a perpetual garbage fire in Gehenna, may or may not be true, but the first time you see that is 1100 or 1200 AD. It's not attested to in any ancient source. So it preaches really well, but it has a complicated relationship with history. So I wouldn't make that claim. However, we do know that this is the place where children were sacrificed to Moloch. It's a bad place. People died in Gehenna in pretty horrible ways. And that is described as the fate of the people whose individual sin has brought them to that point. We have, at this point, reached the limits of my research. It merits further study. I don't want to go too much into Gehenna as a New Testament concept because I don't really know a ton about Gehenna as a New Testament concept, except that it is not the same thing as Sheol. It's not the way that they understood the afterlife or the underworld in the ancient Near East. So, given everything that I just mentioned, I'm going to read Psalm 104 one more time. And I want to have this image up, as I read through Psalm 104. And I want you to look at it as I'm reading through it. So I will read out of the New Living Translation this time. Let all I am praise Yahweh. O Yahweh, my God, how great you are. You are robed with honor and majesty. You are dressed in a robe of light. You stretch out the starry curtain of the heavens. You lay out the rafters of your home in the rain clouds. You make the clouds your chariot. You ride upon the wings of the wind. The winds are your messengers. Flames of fire are your servants. You placed the world on its foundation so it would never be moved. You clothed the earth with floods of water, water that covered even the mountains. At your command the water fled. At the sound of your thunder it hurried away. Mountains rose and valleys sank to the levels that you decreed. There you set a firm boundary for the seas so they would never again cover the earth. You make springs pour water into the ravines so streams gush down from the mountains. They provide water for all the animals, and the wild donkeys quench their thirst. Birds nest inside the streams and will sing among the branches of the trees. You send rain on the mountains from your heavenly home, and you fill the earth with the fruit of your labor. You cause grass to grow for the livestock and plants for people to use. You allow them to produce food from the earth, wine to make them glad, olive oil to soothe their skin, and bread to give them strength. The trees of Yahweh are well cared for, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. There birds make their nests, and the storks make their homes in the cypresses. High in the mountains live wild goats, and the rocks form a refuge for the hyraxes. You make the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows when to set. You send the darkness, it becomes night, and when all the forest animals prowl about. Then the young lions roar for their prey, stalk in the food provided by God, and at dawn they slink back into their dens and rest. Then people go off to their work, and where they labor until evening. O Yahweh, what a variety of things you've made, and the wisdom you've made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the ocean, vast and wide, teeming with life of every kind, both large and small. See the ships sailing along, and Leviathan, which you made to play in the sea. They'll depend on you to give them food as they need it. When you supply it, they gather it. You open your hand to feed them, and they are richly satisfied. But if you turn away from them, they panic. When you take away their breath, they die again and turn to dust. When you give them your breath, life is created, and you renew the face of the earth. May the glory of Yahweh continue forever. Yahweh takes pleasure in all that he has made. The earth trembles at his glance, and the mountains smoke at his touch. I will sing to Yahweh as long as I live. I will praise my God to my last breath. May all my thoughts be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in Yahweh. Let all sinners vanish from the face of the earth. Let all the wicked disappear forever. Let all that I am praise Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. Okay. So, just reading through that, do you see how this makes sense now? The waters are above the mountains. They cannot be crossed. The heavens are stretched out like a tent. There's beams over the waters. There's the sun and the moon. You hear all the talk about the mountains. You have the foundation of the earth, these pillars right here. You have the ocean teeming with life where Leviathan frolics. You have sort of the abode of God above everything in the heavens. This makes sense. This other view that we looked at way back here is what it sounds like. This kind of a world. Now, if you compare that, what's this? You know what this is. This is a satellite image of Earth. Now, we know that because we've sent the satellites out, we've taken a picture, and we get what the world actually looks like. Does the language that we just read in Psalm 104 assume this version of the world or this one? Clearly this one. If you showed this picture to an ancient Israelite, I guarantee you they would have no idea what you're talking about. They'd think it looks pretty. They'd probably say it's some kind of amazing looking marble. Or a stone that, you find, a precious jewel. A little bit later, people might start to recognize it a bit as a map. But it's just so different from the way that they thought of the universe and the way that the Bible talks about the universe. And that's part of the point that I'm trying to make here. The Bible describes the creation stories phenomenologically, not physically or scientifically. By that, when I say phenomenological, I mean what someone could observe using his or her five senses. You see a dome above you that is blue, just like water. By the way, what comes from the sky? Water. happens to get pretty dark, and then water comes down. You see, land, and then, especially if you're in Jerusalem, you see water as far as it goes. And you can travel along the coastline, but if you go out far in the kind of boats that they had at the time, you're shipwrecked. And it took a long time for you to be able to traverse straight through on any of the boats that people had. Most of the boats that they have to go hug the coastline, basically. You would see the sun going that way, and then the moon going that way, and then the sun comes back around, and the moon comes back around. You'd see the lights in the dome, and so like all of this, and then when people die, they are absorbed into the ground. So the world is described phenomenologically. Scientific would be an observable, measurable, and repeatable activity that can be reliably produced according to predictable causal principles, regardless of the observer. So when you send a satellite out into orbit and it takes a picture, you can do that over and over and over again, and you will continue to see the same sort of thing. It gives you a different perspective on what's going on. We've shot rockets up there. We've been to the moon. The moon is actually not on the inside of a dome. It's way out there in space, as is the sun. It's not inside a dome. We have lots of... The only reason that you are watching this right now on YouTube is because signals are being sent to a satellite and then back down. The satellite happens to be outside the dome. So we know that this conception of the world just isn't true. But it's the conception of the world that people understood. So, in that way, ancient Hebrew conceptions of the universe bear greater resemblance to the ancient Near Eastern creation stories than to modern physics. And it behooves us then to understand the Bible the way it was written, so that we don't make claims that the Bible doesn't require us to make, and make those some kind of test of orthodoxy. We should not say, and I haven't heard it myself personally, but I've read the quotes that the earth is a square because it says that God stretched out the earth to the four corners, or like sent something to the four corners of the earth or something in the Bible. And since the Bible is true, it's God's word that just dropped out and exists completely outside its historical and cultural context, because it is the word of God no matter what, exactly as I'm reading it right now as a 20th, 21st century person in the United States of America, a completely undiscovered land at the time. Whatever I think it means is obviously what it's meant for all time. It doesn't work that way. We need to know what claims the Bible is making and affirm that. And when the Bible is using ancient language, we must be able to understand that. So, God spoke to people using the idiom of the time. God did not try and teach quantum mechanics, Big Bang cosmology, or whatever the future cosmological model is going to be, because we're going to have another one, to ancient people. Why? How would you expect an ancient Canaanite to understand quantum physics when the wheel is not even really being appropriated at that point in time? Pottery and masonry and metallurgy are very new concepts. There's no mechanics, there's no thermodynamics, there's no physics. How would you... It would be as if I would take this class and teach it in the 4-year-old Sunday school. There would just be no categories for it. It's not that they're not capable of it. Ancient people are actually far more sophisticated than we give them credit for. But they would not have had enough of an understanding of the world to get it. What that means is that the Bible's not a science book. We can't treat it like a science book. It was never intended to be a science book. It's intended to communicate on the level of meaning, on the level of action and intention, as opposed to the level of object. And so, as such, 21st century interpreters, we need to not get caught in this idea that somehow the Bible, when it's talking about a 3-tier universe, is talking about cosmology or physics. It's not. I would it was trying to communicate. It had to have some meaning to the people who were reading it at the time. And I'm pretty sure that 1,000 years from now, Lord willing, humanity is still around. Humans will will look back at quantum mechanics, sort of the way that we look at bloodletting, and say, "What the heck were they up to?" They thought that's how things worked. That's adorable. Quantum entanglement. It's like they just thought that two things that were completely unrelated started acting, in parallel with each other because that's just the way it was. Well, look, we have this explanatory mechanism now. There's going to be an advancement in understanding. We don't understand everything right now, and neither did the ancients. But the meaning of life, the meaning of existence, what it is to be human, and who God is, and how we fit into that, that's what's being communicated in the Bible. And so we need to not get hung up on some sort of supposed conflict between cosmology and astronomy and religion. Yahweh is the creator of the universe. He's responsible for bringing order out of chaos. Yahweh is the one who superintends all things in all processes in the world. This remains true regardless of what idiom is being used to explain it, whether or not the chaos monster, as was necessary to communicate to ancient people at that time, or for us to think of the vast vacuum of space and calling order out of that. It's not an exact analogy, but space is super scary to us. It's just this void. It might as well be the dark waters of chaos. There's no intelligence. There's nothing. There are just some stray particles in a void, and eventually you come across some chemical reactions. Sometimes you'll come across solid bodies every few thousand years, and the the waters of the deep is not a terrible way of communicating that same concept. It's chaos, whether we understand it or whether it's the way we understand it or the way they understand it. God calling order out of that is the point. So what is the true unchanging theology that we see in creation? We see God taking something and giving it function. This is actually what it meant to the ancients to exist even. You had to have function, not form. It was about naming something. That's what made it real. So when there's darkness over the face of the deep in Genesis 1:2, it's given function. Let there be light, and then the light's day and the darkness is night. Why not call the light light? Why call the light day? Well, it's because it's being given a function. The Spirit of God is hovering over the waters, then those are separated out into heaven, and land and the earth are called forth. The waters are now called the seas, and these waters are now a habitat for sea creatures. That's their function. Let there be lights in the vaulted dome as signs for appointed times and for days and years. So the lights are put up there for the sake of serving a function, the appointed times, days and years. The waters are swarming with living creatures. They are given a function to be fruitful and multiply. Humankind is male and female. They are to rule over the fish and the birds and the animals. The fact that order is called out of chaos, it is given a function, it is given a purpose, and humanity is given a purpose in creation. That's the point. So where does all of this come from? The order has been established by God. And we are involved in that order. And our place in that is our place in God's kingdom, the way that God has ordained us to be, his royal priesthood, his treasured possession, the ones through whom the blessing will come to the world. So that's the core of the theology that is expressed in different idioms for ancient people than it is for us, but it means the same thing. So what do you think this means for the understanding of Genesis 1 and 2? I would say that we need to understand Genesis 1 and 2 as what I just described. That this is not about physics or ontology or astronomy or cosmology. This is about theology This is about function. This is about God calling order out of chaos, giving us a role in it, and then taking up his dwelling with us. Genesis chapter 1 is, I think John Walton argues persuasively, it's a temple creation and inauguration. And temples are where God dwells. And God is dwelling within this temple here on earth with his people. And so what impact does this have? And this is one I'm interested in seeing at the class tonight. What impact does it have in your understanding of, and I'm using these words, the inerrancy of Scripture? Authority of Scripture is probably the better way to put it, because inerrancy has a very particular meaning. The way that I understand inerrancy is it's without error in what it affirms and denies. And the question is, what does it affirm or deny? The problem isn't with the Bible, it's with the way people have been reading the Bible. In order to speak to all people across all cultures, human language and culture and idiom must be used. Human language and culture cannot be separated. We see how much language changes in a year, or 2 years, or 5 or 10 years. We're reading a text that's thousands of years old. Of course it's different. And so we need to be able to get ourselves into that mindset and not try and take this and then, or take the text and place it into our context and then pretend that it means the same thing, or it should, or stubbornly insist that it means something in my context right now without me needing to know anything about history. That's not the way that human language works, and that's what we were given. We were given human language. That's what God did. It is problematic to assume that the Bible exists outside of its historical context. Otherwise, you're going to have to affirm a three-tiered universe. Some people actually do. Please don't do that. We have satellites. Again, if you were watching this on YouTube, it is a refutation of the three-tiered universe. So if the Bible uses idiom, it's not making a metaphysical claim, but a symbolic claim. The Bible affirms that Yahweh is the creator of all things, that in him all things hold together. This is communicated in the ancient Near East using culturally relevant language. In the Old Testament, it was using culturally relevant Greco-Roman language in the New Testament, and we must do so again today using ours without getting snagged on the idea that we're somehow dealing with a cosmological truth, that there is a vaulted dome of waters over top of us. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed the discussion of ancient Near Eastern cosmology as it relates to the authority of the Bible. I hope that this, paired with the idea of the divine council last week, also can really help people who are trying to understand what's really in there get their heads around it, and then understand the real depth of the task of being a biblical interpreter and doing it appropriately. All language is culture bound and historically bound. We must understand that if we intend to understand the Bible. While it's not a salvation issue, if you want to be able to grow from your own study of Scripture, then you have to be willing to put in the work. And I hope that this gives you some ideas of how to do that, and that as you read through the Bible, knowing more about this, you can begin to feed yourself from Scripture. So we will have one more of these at some point in the future on Book 5 of the Psalms, and I look forward to seeing you then. God bless.